Kia ora koutou katoa. Welcome to The Hoon, where co-host Peter Bale and I go around the week's news in geopolitics and Aotearoa's political economy with a whole bunch of experts, academics and politicians. Yes, and welcome in today, everyone. I hope you've managed to jump on it for our regular end of the week. Hoon, I'm Bernard Hickey with Peter Bale on the road in a fresh location as our co-host today. Peter, how are you?
Bernard, I'm good. I've just landed in Taupo, driven down from I was going to say London, from Auckland to Taupo, because I decided to split. I was going to drive all the way to Pahiatua tomorrow to see the Polish refugee kids, but I didn't want to do it in one hit, and I'm just as well because there's a ridiculous deviation on Highway 1, and so I'm glad to have split it. So hopefully I'll be able to go for a run along the beach at Taupo, around the waterfront at Taupo tomorrow. Taupo.
Yes, and we will include a link to your article in this week's Listener about the Polish refugees. A fantastic story
Well, that's kind of you.
of a piece of history that not many people know about, but when they do find out, they're sort of stunned at the epicness of
Yes,
the
yes.
story of these kids and how they've gone.
No, it's absolutely. Stupid thing is I really care about it, and so I have a bottle of Polish Zbrojka vodka in my chilled and on ice in my bag to take to the 92-year-old man who I interviewed for that story, Mike Markowski, and his son, who's a mate of mine. And it is a remarkable story. And the more I look at it, the more I'd like to do something more substantial with it. It's very nice to have had a couple of thousand words in the Listener, but the more I know about it, the more extraordinary it is that any of these kids survived, really. And of course, there were 35,000 of them, I think, left Siberia in 1942. 700 of them ended up in New Zealand, 750 or so. But only 13,000 of them got to Iran ultimately. So, the tale of suffering. And weirdly, last night I was in Woolworths, or what used to be called Countdown, and got chatting to a woman who was, as usual, helping me at the self-help counter because I hate those things, especially, and of course it always wants me to confirm that I'm over 21 or whatever it is for drinks. And got chatting to her, and it turns out she was Polish. I said, is that a Polish accent? And she said, well, yes, it is. I'm half Polish, but I come from Kazakhstan.
Wow.
And I thought,
so maybe one of the kids who didn't make
and
it.
I said, do you know how your Poles got there? She said, no, I don't. I haven't got a clue. So I went and bought her a copy of the Listener and gave it to her. So I don't know whether that will work. That I have just solved the mystery of where she came from. But it wouldn't surprise me at all if she was the descendant of the many thousands of Poles who ended up in Kazakhstan. In a sense, the lucky ones who got to Iran. And then certainly the very lucky ones who got to Pahiatua. But I think it would be absolutely fascinating to go to central Mexico and find out what happened to the 1,400 kids that ended up there. Somebody told me recently that there was a village in South Africa that took a whole bunch of them, and that they are still there as well. There are descendants of them there. But I wonder what's happened to the ones who went to Zaire and northern Rhodesia, as it was then, to Rhodesia and to Tanzania. Or Tanzania, as we might have called it in those days.
It is an extraordinary story, if only when you think about 1942, in the midst of, an existential conflict for New Zealand, and we took 900. So this, relative to the size of our population, which was about a third of what it is now, that's a really big number of kids. And
well, it certainly was, and I think I've maybe discussed this with you. I can't remember whether I mentioned it last week, but I found out from a historian that virtually the night before I was about to file the story to the Listener, that the Orange Order objected to these kids and later Polish soldiers coming because they were Catholic. And of course, we had already been very, very limited in the number of Central Europeans, and particularly Jews, who we took fewer than 1,000 people, or about 1,000 people between 1933 and 1943, and were very hesitant about them being seen to be Jewish. I think there's a lot to be done about that, thought about that.
What I didn't understand or didn't know was that towards the end of the war, the Russians demanded that we send them back.
Yes, well, the Poles did, yes, and the
Yeah.
Poles then sent an inspector. Have you read the story now, Bernard?
Oh no,
Did
you
you go and
keep
buy a
telling
copy
me.
of the Listener?
No, no, no. You're an
You
excellent
still
in
haven't read
person.
bloody? Oh, I sent you. Yeah, Jesus Christ. Yes, they did. So the Poles, the Polish communist government, yes, the Russian puppet government, demanded them back. 90% of them stayed in New Zealand, and it was Peter Fraser and Nash decided to go from having invited them to stay temporarily to give them proper refugee status, and they stayed permanently. So what are we going to do today with the? So I'll be broadcasting for you from Pahiatua tomorrow if you like, Bernard. We can do a Hoon. We're going to have Elaine. Just David Moring's asking what we're talking about today. So we're going to have Elaine Monaghan come back on from DC. One of the things that I wanted her to address in particular is it's the 5 days now till the election, but is the role of what I'm calling oligarchs, or the likelihood of the creation of an oligarch economy under the Trump administration, and the reason we see so many people like Elon Musk and others slipping in behind Trump, and then this weird determination of Jeff Bezos, the second richest person in the world, to not let his business interests be jeopardized by his ownership of the Washington Post. I think we'll talk a little bit about that without turning it too much into a media fest. And we've got Robert Patman coming on as usual. I hope for that. But also, I want to ask Robert a bit more about the vote in the Israeli Parliament, the Knesset, this week, to refuse to deal with the UNRWA, which is the 70-year-old UN agency that really is the only way now of getting aid into Gaza, but which certain elements of the Israeli and Zionist movements absolutely hate and have hated for nearly 70 years. And what this all means about Israel's relationship with the UN. When we, they've literally declared the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, persona non grata. It's just unbelievable. And of course, we've got the usual excellence from Catherine.
Yes, it is great to have Catherine here as our climate correspondent. We've spent a bit more time talking about some of the news in our weekly climate wrap, which will be going up tomorrow morning. But Catherine, I wanted to firstly talk about gas stoves and gas hobs, a commonplace thing in many homes. And, there's a certain, high end of homes where you daren't make an omelette without a proper, gas flame and a fry pan. But what have we learned from the latest research on gas hobs and gas stoves inside houses?
Yeah, kia ora, everybody. So there's been a new report, and there's been a few studies that have come out in recent years. There was one from the US back in May this year, but this one comes from the EU, from a university in Spain, actually, that was looking at that they were doing a health impact assessment of the effects of using gas cookers indoors, and they found at least 40,000 premature deaths in Europe, so that's in the EU plus the UK, that are related to nitrogen dioxide from gas cooking. Now that premature death toll is twice as high as the death toll from car crashes in Europe. So twice as many people are dying from the effects of cooking indoors on gas. And that the average person who cooks on a gas stove is shaving 2 years of their life.
Yes, and it really goes to show the health effects, which are the benefits of electrifying your economy away from not just gas in the home, but of course petrol and diesel. One of the biggest killers we have is the particulates from diesel and the problems with people's respiratory tracts and all of those things. Peter, you've been noticing
Well,
some issues
just
around
on that
health.
one, you remember, of course, that Fox News in the States were really more the last cycle of the presidential elections, there was this idea that they're going to take away our stoves, they're going to take away our hamburgers because they want us to eat it, and they're going to take away our stoves. I must admit, I was talking with someone very close to me this week about her kitchen redevelopment, and one of the few things that she was absolute about was that she wanted a gas hob rather than a ceramic, convection
Or
one. Induction one, and I think this hopefully will make her change her mind.
Yes.
I'd rather she lived two extra years than not.
And it
Yeah,
turns out,
absolutely.
Catherine, you were saying, Catherine, that it turns out it's not just, if you've got your head over the gas stove, it goes all around the house.
Yeah, well,
Yes.
those gases travel through the house and down corridors, and then they end up in bedrooms where they come to a dead end because there's nowhere to go from that. And so the gas just sits around in the air in bedrooms for hours. And so you cook your nice family deal, and then you put your kids to bed in a room where they are breathing in, nitrogen dioxide is the main thing that they were testing in this study, which causes asthma and all sorts of other problems as well. And then wonder why, so many of our kids have asthma. So even knowing that, there are things that you can do to mitigate the effects, things like keep all the corridors and bedroom doors closed when you're cooking, make sure that your rooms are well ventilated, use your hood range to extract air, all of those sort of things can help to mitigate the risk. But at the end of the day, you want to electrify, you don't.
No, it's quite interesting. And Catherine, I much prefer. Well, I thought I much preferred cooking with gas. A lovely friend of mine has a really super fancy induction hob, which I actually find quite irritating because if you have damp fingers and things, it's not always good. This is going to sound really pretentious, but in my house in Spain, we have a very nice induction hob, which we made sure had proper knobs rather than electronics that get in the way of with your wet fingers. But I remember talking to the lovely chef Peter Gordon about this because his new restaurant, unfortunately now closed, Homeland, was fully induction, and it does cause problems for chefs, but. He made a real point of having theoretically an environmentally friendly chef's kitchen.
Yeah.
Oh, yes. And Francis Kinraid asks, what about gas barbecues? I assume exactly the same is the
should use
case,
them
except
outdoors.
that they're outside. You use
Yeah.
it, yeah, well,
But the other thing, of course,
unless you're Flight of the Conchords. Do you remember when they stayed with the Australians and the Australians were refused to they barbecued all the time and had scorch marks up the side of their house?
I actually, when I lived in Vietnam, like just about everybody cooks from a gas bottle that's in the cupboard to a gas stove, which is inherently a bit risky. But yeah, I didn't enjoy that very much. And I do remember years ago renting a place that had a gas oven that the starter, the ignition had broken, so you had to climb into the oven with a lighter and light up the gas and then get out before your eyebrows disappeared. So I've never
what could
liked
possibly go wrong with that?
I've never liked gas. So yeah.
And that's not the only health risk of going ahead with gas. There's a big report that's come out this week in the Lancet about the climate risks and health risks. Peter, you've noticed.
Well, I did. It's just extraordinarily interesting because there's two aspects to all of this as far as I'm concerned. One is you've seen, I think 72 people have been killed in Spain with this latest. I think Valencia got a year's rain in an evening, and so it's pretty phenomenal. That has happened before. There's a Spanish phenomenon of the warm air from the Mediterranean catching a cold wind direction and suddenly dropping tremendous amounts of rain. But the propensity for all of this to happen more, and then there's the sort of long-term health risks that the Lancet is talking about, which are all sorts of things about ambient heat stress, sleep hours lost to high temperatures. It's a very sort of it's an interesting piece about how we're going to live with it. Did you look at it, Catherine? Did you get a chance to look at it?
I don't know if I've looked at the same one you're talking about, because the one that I remember reading was a little while ago. It's not something that just came out, but this is a growing area of research, and I think what you're going to find is that they're just, it's just the tip of the iceberg, what we're learning about these things at the moment, because
Yeah, we're
there's
not going to say the tip of the iceberg anymore because there's not going to be any icebergs left fairly
Yeah.
soon.
yeah, there won't be
Yes.
much of that. But yeah, so things like heat stress, deaths from heat stress, and like pollution is one of the highest causes of death in the world at the moment, and we never really talk about that very much, or we're kind of quite unaware of it. This is sort of something that goes on in the background, and I think as we take away the pollutants that are associated with fossil fuels, we'll start to realise, that will be helpful in terms of reducing the amount of deaths. But on the other hand, the deaths from heat stress and all of the other things that are happening are going to keep growing, and also unfortunately accelerating. The rate at which these things are building up is on an accelerating path.
Just finally, Catherine, on the climate section this week, we've got a new pledge from the likes of Michael Mann and Johan Rockstrom, a real zero pledge. Can you talk about real zero versus net zero?
Yeah, so there's sort of been an increasing amount of concern about the practice of offsetting and trying to balance, damage in one place with something positive somewhere else. And some of these scientists, there was a group of scientists from 9 countries, have put together this pledge saying we have to start talking about real zero instead of net zero. Like net zero by 2050 is not. We know that a lot of the offsets that are claimed are not really real, and you also, particularly when it comes to things like forestry, you're really just replanting forests that were cut down in the past. Your only offset really is what we did in the past, not what we're doing now somewhere else. And so, yeah, they're saying that we really have to start setting our targets and our measures in terms of real zero and not net zero.
And we'll be sure to forward that letter on to Simeon Brown and Simon Watts and the government, who continue to say that they're on track to meet our various legislated and internationally agreed targets, including the Paris Agreement targets. And in our weekly climate wrap out tomorrow, we talk a bit more about how big the increase in emissions will have to be, and we're starting to see big commitments from other countries in the next round of the COP. So, Catherine, thank you very much for coming on. And for those who would like more, there's going to be a weekly climate wrap that comes out tomorrow morning.
And if you look for Lancet and Climate on Google, you'll find the piece that I've been mentioning about their latest report.
And we'll include it in the show notes as well as the letter from the scientists on Real Zero. Fantastic. Elaine, welcome in. Great to see you from the other side of the world.
Elaine. Thank you. We had a lovely chat. David Coombe, who is one of our biggest fans, said, "Gosh, that Elaine is so exciting, such an interesting and exciting person. You've had such an exciting life, Peter." And I thought, well, it's not over yet. Thank you very much. Jesus Christ. Now, Elaine, how are things in DC? Have you started packing your bags to move and filling out the forms to come to New Zealand?
Well, it's on my short list of things to do in the next couple of weeks.
Yes. Yeah. So if anybody wasn't here last week, Elaine Monaghan is a former Reuters correspondent and a former Times of London correspondent, a professor of journalism and an all-round excellent person, and also a very experienced Eastern European, Central European and Russia correspondent. And I think all of those things are coming together. Now, one of the things that I thought we might talk about today, Elaine, and I'm so grateful that you can do this from DC at after midnight your time. Elaine, you might want to turn up your microphone, the sensitivity of your microphone as well and if you go into sound on your settings, if you've got a Mac. I thought it would be interesting to talk about the oligarch nature of what we're seeing with Elon Musk contributing, I think, $100 million so far in a super PAC to Trump, turning up with what Kara Swisher described as a Nazi font "Make America Great" hat at the Madison Square Garden event, abusing his platform, X, to promote Trump. You've then got people like Bill Ackman, the rather strongly pro-Israel, if not pro-Zionist, hedge fund manager who's very, very, pro-Trump. There's a lot of them about. And then we had this weird thing this week where allegedly Jeff Bezos himself decided that for the first time in 50 years, the Washington Post would not give an endorsement of a particular presidential candidate, and then presented that as a decision against bias and to promote trust. Since when he's now lost 250,000 subscribers to the Washington Post. Talk to us about oligarchs and what makes it familiar to you from Russia, Elaine.
So I'm certainly not the only Russia person who's seen these parallels, and of course Fiona Hill, who, as you probably remember, served in the Trump administration, has been drawing these parallels in the last few days. I suppose one thing that strikes me as we talk about the Jeff Bezos story is that, the subscription losses for him are like a bad day at the office, whereas for the Post it's a tenth of its subscriptions. So, it's very complicated trying to sort of figure out how that relates to the sort of oligarchic relationships that one might think about in the Russian context, where obviously the role of the oligarchs was unfolding at a very different time in sort of that country's history. But Peter, you and I were talking about a sort of historical moment in Russian oligarchy history, which perhaps gives us an opportunity to draw a bit of a comparison, which was that Mikhail Khodorkovsky, in 2003, I think it was, famously was on television alongside...
Just, Elaine, let me just stop you 1 second. Is it feasible for you to turn up the sensitivity of your microphone?
Yeah, so let me just...
Are you on a Mac?
Yes, I am.
If you go to System Settings, Sound, and Input, you can increase the input volume. So, System, Sound,
Yes.
Input,
Okay.
and increase it to probably halfway to 75%.
How is that now?
It's still pretty dreadful.
Oh dear.
I know that
You're-
sounds slightly better there.
You're not the kind of person to whisper.
No, is that any better now?
That's much
That
better.
is-
Yep,
that
that's
is.
much better.
It
You could
may
turn it up a
actu-
bit.
It may
Thank-
have
yeah.
been the position of my microphone, actually. with apologies.
no worries.
Yes, well, Simon will get Toby, but I just thought we'd stop there. We'll edit all
Thank
of this
you.
out,
No,
but if you don't
Thank
mind,
you.
you're too important to miss. So,
Well, thank you.
yeah, so let's go back to that. So because this whole thing reminds me of that amazing Putin meeting with Khodorkovsky and the other Russian executives, where he essentially said, I do the politics, you can make the money, do not enter the political regime administration. Is that how it worked out, Elaine?
Well, it didn't turn out too well for Khodorkovsky, who, as you recall, was in jail for a long time until Putin decided to free him.
Yes.
In what appeared to be a whim. So, I guess if there's a lesson to be learned from that for the likes of Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk, and I draw this parallel hesitantly, it's that, these friendships sealed in billions of dollars can turn in a heartbeat, and so they should perhaps be careful what they wish for. But the other thing that sort of strikes me as we think about businessmen, and they are all men, making this pact with Trump, apparently to differing degrees, is that there isn't really a kind of precedent for that in the American context. So it's hard to know what direction this will take us in. But certainly it's all being channeled through social media, particularly in the case of Musk,
Yeah.
who is,
But Elaine, there is a precedent too. The 1890s, the J.P. Morgans, the railway barons, Teddy. I was thinking today about Teddy Roosevelt, and of course, if you remember, he was a leader of the Know Nothings,
right.
who were very much keen on Americans, America first. Should I just say, I mean, I'm slightly buggered all this up by your sound issues, but we've got Professor Robert Patman on, who
Hi,
is
guys.
another one of your greatest fans, Bobby, as we call him on the
Thanks,
show.
Thanks, Rod.
So we've got the Know Nothings, these parallels. That Madison Square Garden event was incredibly similar to a 1939 American Nazi rally in Madison Square Garden, which was ostensibly about not letting the urging the United States not to go into the Second World War. I mean, there's a huge amount of precedent for this, and I think we should all. I would like to recommend that everybody reads quickly the Philip Roth book, Plot Against America, which is
I would
essentially
recommend not reading it right now, actually.
Yeah, no,
But
all right, no, not if you're wanting the blood pressure to go
not
up.
if you're planning to sleep at all in the next 2 weeks.
But
There-
Elaine,
there-
and I may ask Robert this one, and again, I'm sorry if I've confused you a little bit, but Timothy Snyder, the Yale, incredibly clever Yale professor, I recommend his book Bloodlands, Europe Between Hitler and Stalin, also on tyranny, and he was a great friend of Tony Judd, who taught me a lot about the world. Robert, Timothy Snyder talks about anticipatory obedience, that this kind of kowtowing to Trump before the election, particularly the issue of Jeff Bezos deciding at the very last moment that the Post, for the first time in 50 years, wouldn't endorse a presidential candidate. What do you think about this idea of anticipating obedience, and then what that means in the sense of using the F word, using the word fascist?
Well, I think a lot of Americans, and particularly some of the people working for the Washington Post, have been deeply disturbed by Bezos' position. And it seems to me that Mr. Trump, in a sense, is already intimidating people. He's made no secret of the fact that should he become president, he will be settling a few scores, not only with some of his enemies in the private sector, but also potential rivals from that area. But also, he's made it quite clear he's going after what he sees as his political enemies, some of whom he classifies as people previously worked for him. And it's disappointing that some of these high-powered people, such as Bezos, the owner of Washington Post, have actually caved in, because in a sense, although I think it's been counterproductive, I don't think Trump's had a particularly good week. That rally in Madison Square Garden didn't particularly go well for him. It looks like Puerto Ricans are now largely going to vote for Kamala Harris. And
But
also,
Robert, I love Puerto Ricans. Puerto Ricans love me. Nobody loves Puerto Ricans more than I do, even though, we remember that I shat on them when the hurricane came.
yeah, well,
Not me,
that's been a
literally,
nice reminder, given the fact that I'm sure Mr. Trump, being the power freak or the power control freak that he is, had a big say in who the warm-up speakers were before
Yes.
the great man came on himself. So I'm sure that I know he's now come up with this very slippery position that he approved the speakers but doesn't endorse what they said. But look, I
mean,
think
the Puerto Rico joke
just
was
to answer
on
your
a-
question,
Yeah, go
Peter,
ahead.
directly.
Sorry, yes.
There was a wonderful conversation that you probably saw between Mehdi Hassan, who is the CEO of Zatel, and Steve Schmidt, who was a former advisor to, I think it was John McCain and other Republicans, and I think George W. Bush, campaign advisor. And they said that not only the question of fascism was very real, but both of them were pessimistic that violence could be avoided, whatever the outcome of the result
Yes.
of the election. They really felt, and they were being very serious, they said that Mr. Trump's in a position that he won't accept, he won't acknowledge defeat by Kamala Harris under any circumstances. And should that play out, and these are pretty sensible people, I don't think they were making these comments lightly. In fact, Steve Schmidt I think was saying it with a great deal of anguish. But yeah, I mean, I think that if Mr. Trump goes through with his line that, and he's repeated it, that unless he wins, the election is rigged. He's already making massive complaints in Pennsylvania,
Yes.
which of course people on the social media, many of whom are interpreting the fact that he's actually well behind now in Pennsylvania. Because he's making all sorts of, even
Just
his
before you come
campaign,
in, Bernard.
one of his staff got professional actors in, you probably saw this on the social media, to, how should I put it, create a situation. Anyway, I think that it's a very, very, I mean, Elaine would have much better comment, insights than I have from this distance, but it seems to be a particularly tense election we're facing at the moment, and I think many of us will breathe a sigh of relief if we can get through without any violence, because I think
Yes.
that many of Trump's supporters are absolutely at boiling point and are determined, as they put it, not for the election to be stolen again.
Exactly. But just before, Bernard, you come in to ask about the ellipse thing, do you mind if I just want to resolve this fascism thing for 1 minute? Because, Elaine, this is something that you've dealt with before. Robert, you must have thought about this. It is, it's a very big thing to call somebody a fascist, and we kind of think we know it. We think we know what it means. And I was discussing this with an older friend of mine who's a philosopher, and of course, the name comes from the fascisti, the collection of sticks that represented the kind of uniform sense of the people who were supporting Mussolini. Elaine, is this a sensible word to be using? Is there enough evidence?
I mean, I think you have to define your terms, and I think actually what you just said is a really interesting example, because this uniform idea, one of the things that is really striking about the Trump supporters is how similar they look and the kind of uniforms that they are wearing. And actually to pick up on something that Robert was saying, yes, it's true that the Madison Square Garden rally looked like an absolute dumpster fire, but I'm not completely sure that it really was. And a big part of the reason is that, first of all, Biden came out afterwards and took this floating garbage island, description of Puerto Rico and turned it on its head and said garbage is the right word to use for his supporters, not for Puerto Ricans. And of course, it turned into a ridiculous fight over an apostrophe. Was he referring to an individual supporter, meaning this terrible comedian, or all of his supporters? Well, of course, as far as Trump and his acolytes are concerned, it doesn't matter if there's an apostrophe or not. And everyone is piling on with this idea that Biden has now denounced all Trump supporters as garbage. And Elon Musk is piling on with this. Bill
Well, they're trying to bring back the deplorables, aren't they?
They are, and to come back to this uniform idea, he has now been, he rode to a rally today in a garbage truck, and then he showed up at the rally wearing, a garbage man workers reflective vests. Of course, next everybody was wearing pads on their ears when he got shot, and now, or nearly got shot, and now we're going to presumably see them all showing up in orange vests. So there's a great deal of kind of performance going on around all of that. But absolutely, the people who study this, Tim Snyder's a perfect example, and others have drawn parallels. And I think this sort of behaviour that that we're seeing certainly suggests that there's a trend going in the wrong direction towards certainly an authoritarian type of leadership. Whether that is how it turns out to be, I mean, it will depend on what he does.
Yeah, I read something during the week about the American historian Robert Paxton, who wrote the definitive book about fascism in France, about the Vichy's, and he has always said that fascism is too easily bandied about. Right. But about January the 6th, the insurrection at the Capitol, he said, it removes my objection to the fascist label. Trump's open encouragement of civic violence to overturn an election crosses a red line. The label now seems not just acceptable, but necessary, close quotes. And that to me, Elaine, not to get too inside baseball with the media aspect of this, but that's why, to me, the Washington Post non-endorsement is so shocking, because the attempt to overthrow democracy that we saw on January the 6th, the attack on the Capitol, the fight, if you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country, that is surely disqualifying if you're the Washington Post and have a mission, which is democracy dies in darkness.
Well, and sorry, Bernard, I know you were trying to get in, but I have to say this thing that's been on my mind. I mean, for me, it's all of the above, and also the sort of, for me, what's so distressing about all of that, first of all, is that the Washington Post has all these wonderful journalists doing incredibly important work, which is now being forced into the shadows, ironically, and because of this drop in subscriptions potentially, but also the fact that the sort of loss of trust that is associated with that, the fact that Bezos is clearly, telling a version of the story that serves his business interests rather than the interests of journalism, even while using the plural first person pronoun we, as if he belongs in the journalism camp, which of course he doesn't. I mean, and that doesn't mean it's not wonderful that he bought the publication and has been supporting it and financing it, but that doesn't mean that he shares the ethos of journalism. And I mean, there's a whole other conversation to be had about whether newspapers should be endorsing candidates at all.
Well, let's just address that briefly, because let's not let this become an inside base, but it is, right. New Zealand, our predominantly New Zealand audience will not necessarily know that there is this kind of and I've occasionally found it weird and a bit sort of isolating. And I know that Will Lewis, the editor, that's a good Freudian slip, because he is in fact the editor-in-chief and the publisher of the Washington Post, as far as I'm concerned. Finds this strange. The editorial boards that write editorials, control the op-ed pages, are rather separate and frequently extremely separate from the journalism of the American newspapers, and they're kind of the carriers of the Holy Grail. And if you look at the Wall Street Journal, which has always had an utterly it's actually more bonkers than usual, but an utterly bonkers editorial page, whereas its journalism is excellent. I mean, do you want to just, as a journalism professor, Elaine, do you want to just quickly address that?
Yeah, I mean, so yes, the separation is the important point here. The fact that most people are no longer reading the news on a thing that you open in your hands makes it that much harder to make that case, though, because it's so much harder to see the sorting of what we're reading. And so I think plenty of readers, I mean, not the Wall Street Journal probably, maybe not even the Post either, are sophisticated enough to be able to tell the difference between something that is clearly not news and is in fact opinion, and is, the opinion of the editorial board rather than an individual person as well. But I think it's very hard to make an argument that this was done for ethical journalistic reasons when it happened in the dying days of the campaign the way that it did. It was all about the timing, and you'd have to consider that alongside all of the other elements of what was said, if you were trying to make an assessment of the ethics of the decision. But I think the timing is the problem, because if they had done it months ago, I mean, people would have, I'm sure, had lots of arguments about it, but it wouldn't have looked as if he was at risk of trying to throw the election to Trump. Now, I mean, there's another argument to be had about whether it matters a damn what the Washington Post has to say about this, and I think the answer is probably not very much. But it's to do with to go back to Tim Snyder's idea of do not obey in advance. It's about the kind of the zeitgeist. It's about the atmosphere that you create when really important people are behaving in a certain way, and these men, with billions and billions of dollars, this club that seems to be surfacing at this point of history, when Bezos is a member of that club, And so that's the troubling element of it for me.
Bernard, people think I'm oppressing you because they don't know that as I do, the question that you're about to ask, and I wanted to sort of, I do want to touch back on the fascism thing. So Bernard, please let me free you from my bullying.
Hardly. No. I ultimately I have the buttons in front of me, and I've been enjoying the conversation. So thank you very much, Elaine. I was struck by the scale of the rally that Kamala Harris had a couple of days ago at the Ellipse. What you could argue is now one of the most important sites in modern American history, and such a pregnant place. And to see not only how well she articulated the problem and the challenge, but also just the sheer scale of it. As someone who's living in Washington, D.C., what did it feel like in the city in the last few days?
So I was particularly struck by she has some really great lines. And the line that has been resonating and people have been talking about is this idea that, Trump will have his enemies list. I will have my to-do list. And I have to say I love that.
It's so simple and so good, yeah.
Right. So and certainly the location of the rally was incredibly historic and significant and poetic and resonant. There are some people who wonder whether it was a good idea for her to be doing that in such close association with the White House, especially after the kind of comment that Biden made about garbage. So but I think the bigger picture is that it put her outside of the White House. It put her on public display in a way that, of course, as vice president, she typically was not, and reminded us all of where she would be if she won. And of course, we don't have historical precedents of women of colour in that location. So certainly, psychologically, I think that was very important. And I don't think that should be underestimated, given that, the gender gap in the vote is obviously going to be really significant. And it's another reminder to women that they are literally being seen in a way they haven't been so far in the White House.
And the numbers, just for me, were extraordinary. 75,000, and the numbers turning up to her rallies seem very high, but it's almost on a completely different plane to what people are talking about in terms of the polls and the swing states, and how, sort of doesn't matter how much enthusiasm she has, unless she's got 10,000 votes in Pennsylvania or a few thousand votes in Arizona, it doesn't matter.
Yeah, there is a disconnect there, and I was one of the kind of hedge fund guys, and I can't remember which one it was now, was using the term coin toss the other day to describe the election, which just felt like such a kind of dismissal of voters, as if they don't matter, and it's a terrible.
Well, also of the scale of the risks.
Right, exactly. It's a terrible analogy. It's not a coin toss. It's not a football game. Or whatever, whoever uses coin tosses at the starts of games. Sorry if I got
cricket.
that wrong for anyone. There you go, cricket. That'll do.
I'm sure it was a cricket reference, yeah.
And not to dismiss the importance of cricket, but it's not a coin toss. They're like, people's lives are depending on this. And in fact, this has really come to the surface again. I don't know if you saw, but Michelle Obama had a very powerful speech at one of the recent rallies where she talked about the life and death consequences for women in pregnancy, of the potential increased hardening up of abortion access. So, there are very serious consequences of this election not to be underplayed. And, Harris is talking about some of those things, and some of those messages are maybe not making it to the top of the stories because the gaffe, horse race, coverage tends to eclipse some of that.
Elaine, we also saw the entry today of the Supreme Court into this, which leads into some very risky directions. So the Supreme Court made a decision about early ballots and how ballots are going to be counted. Then we've seen these various attacks on voting, early postal voting booths and this kind of thing.
Right.
What are the risks here?
So the Virginia ballots, actually, as I understand it, in Virginia, you can register on the day of the election. So the actual consequences of that are probably fairly, well, I mean, we don't know, right? But they don't seem, that doesn't seem to have necessarily an enormous impact, in the sense that those ballot names being removed, they can also be restored. Will it oppress turnout potentially? It could do. So that's one potential consequence. People think they can't vote, therefore they don't vote, but actually they can. So that's one thing to think about. And then, I mean, another thing to look out for in the next few days as well is that the court case against, or the case against Musk, promising $1 million to voters, is coming up for a hearing, I believe it is, in the next couple of days. I think on Thursday, in fact. So that could also have an impact. So, yeah.
I wondered, Robert, if I could ask, as we get closer, how much of the world's politics is now waiting to see which way it goes, and how everything is, in this interregnum between, politics, geopolitics is normal, and we don't know which way to jump until we know who the president is. It seems particularly weird to me, where normally, a foreign policy is relatively or economic policy is relatively common between the main presidential candidates, but this time around, it's like everyone's on tenterhooks waiting for the the decision.
I think that's absolutely correct, and I think the reason is because Mr. Trump's foreign policy vision is so radically different from that of Mr. Biden, and actually, to be quite frank, alarms most of America's allies. We've already spoken about Ukraine. There's little doubt that a Trump presidency will quickly cut off American support for Ukraine. We don't know how Mr. Trump, he's a very unpredictable transactional figure. We don't know how he will pursue his policy towards Gaza, but I think that Mr. Netanyahu is not campaigning on Mr. Trump's behalf in vain. I think he will be. I think that, the present government, the far right government in Israel, would be very pleased with Mr. Trump winning. There's one other point we want to make here that comes back to the point we've touched on. I think alarm is not just concerning the nature of Mr. Trump's vision. There is concern that a Trump presidency actually represents the threat to democracy, and that
Correct.
could have systemic implications for the globe. For example, if democracy did falter under Mr. Trump, that could have reverberations even for other liberal democracies as far removed as New Zealand.
Absolutely.
And of course, it would be a tremendously enabling or emboldening factor for countries like China and Russia. And Mr. Putin's investment, or probably that's a bit harsh to say that, but his encouragement of Mr. Trump seems to have paid dividends. I think Mr. Putin's support for Mr. Trump is obviously based on the fact that he thought that Mr. Trump was a person who could sow considerable discord and polarization. But that's more than paid off, because if Mr. Trump does make it back to the White House, I think, and this is probably beyond Mr. Putin's initial vision for Trump, I think democracy could be on the line. Yeah. And in the United States, in fact, that might be, I know the Democrats are really struggling with trying to win young people, given Biden's disastrous policy towards Gaza. But I think one compelling argument that I heard recently from Mehdi Hassan, who is a big pro-Palestinian person, but he said that the reason he would vote for Kamala Harris, because he thinks whatever the difference is in policy terms, with Harris, at least democracy will keep going.
Correct.
Whereas he absolutely believes that Trump will, as he put it, you won't need to vote again under me because I'm going to fix all the problems, unquote. So I think there's a real, you could just say that's bluster and that's rhetoric, but I think Mr. Trump's behavior, I mean, Jack Smith, the prosecutor, has got a whole serious amount of
He
evidence
really is moving to New Zealand.
that yeah, well, he may be a target, but one thing you have to reflect on, and I'd be very interested in Elaine's take on this, is the fact that Mr. Trump played such a prominent role in that 6th of January insurrection, and yet the long arm of the law hasn't really touched him on that issue, has it? And he's remained to fight again, and he's had, more years to think about what would happen if he ran and lost another election. So it's kind of alarming to me that the American judicial system hasn't really dealt with someone who was deeply implicated in an insurrection. And that worries me. The judicial system has become heavily politicized. The appointment of the 3 very conservative judges by Mr. Trump, and it's having far-reaching political implications.
So, Robert, thank you so much for that. Elaine, would you like to quickly answer that? Because we're going to move to Israel in a section, not literally. Elaine, would you like to answer that question of Robert's?
I mean, the legal aspects of this, I mean, what Maggie Haberman, the New York Times journalist who really does know Trump, I've heard her say recently, really clearly believes that one of his biggest motivating factors is his fear of ending up in jail. So he thinks that's still going to happen. And a lot of the court processes have been interrupted as a result of the circumstances that we're in, although not only for that reason. So, I mean, I think that, if he doesn't win, it's quite conceivable that he will end up paying the consequences.
Yeah. So I'd just like to say, I've been wondering about this. So some of the audience are saying, why are we doing so much on the American elections? I mean, I think it is because it's so consequential. It is huge. And I was thinking about this coming down and thinking about what Elon and some sensible people in Silicon Valley say. And, remember, Elon fired 75% of the staff at Twitter. That's essentially what he wants to do with the US government. So I do think, and I was discussing this with somebody last night, I don't really care about what Harris is like. She's at least a Democratic person with a capital D and not the Democratic Party. May I ask that we take a look at and you can stay on absolutely, Elaine, because you will probably want to intervene in this. Robert, the Israeli decision or the Israeli vote in the Knesset to prevent any connection between UNRWA and Israeli, to make it illegal for UNRWA to operate across the Israeli territory, seems another extraordinary strike at the UN as an institution by Israel.
It's an extraordinary strike against the UN, but it's also an extraordinary strike against Palestinians who are heavily dependent, not just in Gaza, but also the West Bank, on the role of UNRWA. And a number of countries have actually directly criticised Israel's decision and warned them not to follow through. And I was very struck by the fact that the US ambassador to the UN has been not pulling any punches about what she says is a disgraceful humanitarian situation in Gaza. We've heard the United States express repeatedly concerns about the plight of civilians in Gaza. I'm just wondering if Mr. Netanyahu is big and his party, he's obviously got the measure through Parliament, but this is an extremely bleak outcome. And we're already talking about an appalling humanitarian situation. Take the siege of Gaza, northern Gaza. 1,000 people have died there, either bombed or now suffering from severe malnutrition. And this is a real challenge to the United States as well, the leadership. I know they've got an election on, but this is an extraordinary step. Mr. Netanyahu has made a series of very serious allegations about UNRWA being basically in the control of Hamas. Yeah. The UN carried out an investigation in which they suspected that 9 members were.
Of 13,000 staff in Gaza alone. And
then the evidence that Mr. Netanyahu has presented to back up his allegations was not described as compelling. and they have had a campaign against UNRWA for a long time. Remember, the deeper thing is that we often lose sight of this. We worry about Israel and Iran and Israel and Hezbollah. Behind all this is Mr. Netanyahu's determination not to entertain the idea of a Palestinian state. And he doesn't want to do anything that makes that possibility. And this is why he refuses to discuss the day after with the United States. He doesn't want a Palestinian state. And UNRWA, which feeds and provides medical and other humanitarian services, food, medicine, and other services, are the main support that people in Gaza and the West Bank have. So he has absolutely no political interest in maintaining that.
Robert, let me ask you a question about that, which we did ask Helen Clark a couple of weeks ago when she was on, and I in fact was hoping to get her on today. And it's one which IP67, one of our audience, who tends to take a very pro-Israel position, which I perfectly understand and is perfectly valid, says, why do the Palestinians have UNRWA when the UNHCR looks after refugees elsewhere, and why 70 years later do the Palestinians have a special organisation to look after them? I know why.
Because 700,000 Palestinians were displaced with the establishment of Israel, and in a hurry, an organisation had to be created to support them and feed them, and so you have generations of refugees. And UNRWA was established shortly after the establishment of Israel, and it was established to provide a range of services to people who've been displaced from their homes and where they lived. And that is why it's been going so long, and that's why it's a dedicated service. There are a number of people in refugee camps in Gaza who are the descendants of people who previously fled.
And they've still got the keys and everything else. It's very like the Poles and the Sephardic Jews from the Inquisition, who still have their keys since 1492. Elaine, do you want to comment on that before we move to New Zealand politics for the last couple of minutes of this? There's a shitload happening here.
Very briefly. Well, I mean, it's so hard to talk and briefly about what's happening in Israel, and given the historical sweep that you've just described. And I always come back to my optimism from having watched the Northern Ireland peace process reach a positive conclusion. I still believe anything is possible, and a lot of people who've been working for peace for a very long time are still resolutely optimistic, and as long as they are, then I am too. But I will just say that the CIA director, William Burns, and okay, no jokes about US CIA history, please, when I tell you this, and other envoys are actually on their way to Egypt and Israel now. So, they're obviously taking the situation very seriously and continuing.
Thanks, Elaine. I think that Irish comparison is a really excellent one. Thank you both for making that. So, shall we finish up there, Bernard, and go to New Zealand politics?
Indeed. Thank you so much, Elaine and Robert. It's lovely to have you on. It's such a...
Thank you.
The next time we talk will be after the election, so I also agree with Peter that this is enormously consequential. There hasn't been enough discussion in New Zealand about how important it is. We are part of the world, and just from our discussion at the beginning of today's Hoon about how we took in 900 refugees from Poland who had walked the width of Russia to get to Iran to come here and have built their lives here, and were protected in New Zealand because of the dramas of that war, protected by Peter Fraser, the then Prime Minister, who went on to help found the United Nations. We will talk about this election. Thank you very much, Robert and
Thanks,
Elaine.
Thanks, Robert.
And Peter, on this week's domestic politics, the dominant theme remains the government's epic fiscal crunch, which is causing all sorts of grief all around the economy. It means that our economic recession is extending into the third year when the rest of the world is having soft landings. And we're seeing it all over the place. And the most immediate example is come up today, an interview between 9 to noon and a cardiologist at Tauranga Hospital, who has pointed out that Lester Levy is living in La La Land if he thinks that $1.5 billion worth of cuts that he's planning right now is not going to affect actual services. And the only reason there's still a service is that most of the doctors there are working double time and not being paid for it. He's actually just resigned because of burnout. It's
Not Lester Levy, I fear.
no, and this is
Well, as you know, we both know some doctory people, medical people, and I think the view is that Lester Levy is at risk of supporting not necessarily deliberately, but at risk of favouring what amounts to the privatisation of New Zealand Health.
Yes, and it seems extraordinary to me that this current government is going down a path of austerity, ideological neoliberalism, in the face of the evidence that it simply did not work. Not just after the end of the Cold War, but after the global financial crisis, and the whirlwind we are reaping now with the grief in our democratic political systems, where those people who lost out in the ructions from neoliberalism and austerity are now revolting. And they're revolting in a way which makes the system, not just the democratic system, but the capitalist system, more unstable and unsustainable. And it beggars belief to me that an entire group of intelligent, connected people believe that yet more of the same austerity, government as a household, is going to make the world a better place, when 40 years of history, countless academic studies, the experts now in global policy, and the ones that normally that side of politics have welcomed. So we're talking the IMF, the OECD, the World Bank, the World Economic Forum, are all saying it doesn't work, dude. Stop. And yet we're ploughing on with the most aggressive fiscal tightening we've seen in our history for no good reason, when we don't even have a debt crisis to respond to. You could argue Ruth Richardson did in 1991. This fiscal crunch is going to be deeper and harder than that for no good reason, other than an ideological view that the size of government should be ever smaller, and somehow that we can deliver the promised services with less money in real terms per capita. So
So you've done a soliloquy there, and also to all of those people who said I was suppressing you before, oppressing your,
I
if
feel
anybody
well
knew
and
the
truly.
difference in size between us, Bernard, the idea of me oppressing you is
Well, I feel
ridiculous. But
I feel well
yeah,
and truly unleashed. So thank you very much,
good,
Peter, and
excellent.
thank you,
So shall we
thank you
do a
very
quick?
much.
Shall
Yes,
we do a quick skateboarding dog?
Yes.
Because it's a political one, but it's quite a nice political one, which is that a British Airways flight to the United States from Heathrow was delayed, and 2 women had to be taken off because they were fighting over one of the women wearing a MAGA hat.
Ah,
And a woman in her 40s and a woman in her 60s made counter allegations of a fray, the police said. And British Airways said, Heathrow's source said, with the US presidential election so close, tensions are sky high, literally.
sky high.
Airline
Yes.
crew could not run the risk of a full-scale punch-up at 30,000 feet. BA officials cannot recall a flight being delayed before due to a passenger's baseball cap. It was extraordinary.
Yes, those MAGA hats. A fray. What a great word.
I know. Yeah,
Guilty of a fray.
Yeah, I don't know. I feel as though we could go. I feel like making a soliloquy of my own, Bernard, about whether I'm completely wrong about Trump, and that in fact he is just the firm smack of government or lack of government that America needs. But I don't actually think that, and I prefer Tim Snyder's view of the world, I suspect, which is that there's a warning from history here.
Yes, and history will be made in the next 7 days, indeed. We'll see you all again in a week's time on The Hoon. I'm Bernard Hickey. And thanks again to Peter Bale, our co-host, and our regular guests, Catherine Dyer, Robert Patman, and a special guest, Elaine Monaghan. Thank you very much. Ka kite anō. That has been the Hoon for the
Thank you
week
so much, everybody.
to November 1st. Ka
And
kite anō.
free Bernard from Pedro.
See you all next week. Bye-bye. Bye. Cool. That seems to have loaded. And I'm just looking. We seem to be... Yes, Elaine successfully uploaded, as is Robert and me and you. So we're good.
Good. I wonder if my internet at home is not as good as it should be.